Okay. Welcome, everybody. My name is Grace Campbell, and I'm the coordinator of UNCA's Senior Humanities course, Humanities 414, the Individual and the Contemporary World. And I'm very pleased to be able to introduce to you today our guest speaker, Dr. James Ferguson. Dr. Ferguson is one of the country's most prominent civil rights attorneys. He is co-founder and president of the Charlotte law firm of Ferguson, Stein, and Chambers, internationally renowned for expert handling of cases involving civil rights, civil liberties, and the rights of the accused. A native of Asheville, and a 1960 graduate of Stevens Lee High School, Ferguson was the first president of the Asheville Student Committee on Racial Equality, which held peaceful demonstrations that led to the desegregation of local establishments during 1959 through 1965. An activist and a leader at North Carolina College at Durham, which is now North Carolina Central University. He graduated summa cum laude and attended Columbia University Law School as a John Hay Whitney Fellow. Ferguson has devoted his career to change through peaceful means. He has received numerous awards, including the National Conference of Community and Justice Humanitarian Award and the Frank Porter Graham Award of the North Carolina Civil Liberties Union. A longstanding board member of the American Civil Liberties Union, he co-founded the North Carolina Association of Black Lawyers and was past president of the North Carolina Academy of Trial Lawyers. He is also a member of the exclusive Inner Circle of Advocates and a fellow of the American College of Trial Lawyers. Ferguson has held positions at Harvard, at North Carolina Central and Santa Clara Law Schools. He coordinated South Africa's first trial advocacy program under the auspices of the Black Lawyers Association of South Africa. This bio would go on if we had time for me to read it. But without further ado, let me ask you for one favor. When it is time for the question and answer session, I am going to hold this mic and hand it to those of you who will undoubtedly have lots of questions for Dr. Ferguson. So please welcome our esteemed guest, Dr. James Ferguson.
Thank you so very much for that kind and warm introduction. It's indeed a great pleasure for me to be here with you on this special day. I do have a question for myself that I have in my mind when I looked and I saw so many people in the room. My question is this required attendance? Or are they being given academic credit for attendance? It must be one or the other. But it is indeed a pleasure for me to see so many of you out on this occasion. This is indeed a special occasion because today in this country we observe Constitution Day. And that's an important occasion for all of us because when we talk about the Constitution, we're talking about the founding document for the country, sort of the how-to-do guide for living in the United States. But on Constitution Day, when we talk about the anniversary of the Constitution, I think this is the 220th anniversary of the Constitution of the United States. And when we talk about that Constitution, all sorts of ideas are conjured up in the minds of people. We're inclined to praise and extol the Constitution for being the document that has brought us to where we are today, the document that provides our freedom, the document that has fueled and promoted justice and the civil rights movement and the rights of all people. But in truth, if we look at the Constitution as a document, then I have to give you the reality that the Constitution itself was not a particularly laudable document at the time it was drafted in 1987 by a convention of folks in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. They went there indeed to improve the Articles of Incorporation. They wound up coming out acting far beyond the scope of their authority and proposing a constitution. But from where I sit, as one who has devoted my life to working in civil rights, both here at home in Asheville and throughout the country and indeed throughout the world, I look at it as a document and I say, in reality, the Constitution was a flawed document when it comes to civil rights and when it comes to the rights of many people. Think about it. The document that emerged from the convention in Philadelphia never once mentioned the word civil rights. More importantly, that document preserved slavery, the antithesis of civil rights. It guaranteed that the slave trade could continue in the United States for at least 21 years, from 1887 until, I'm sorry, let me get my dates right, 1787 until 1808. So there was nothing in the Constitution itself which moved us forward toward civil rights. So when we think about what rights were protected in the Constitution, very few rights were protected other than property rights. I sometimes say that the Constitution itself is the best argument for diversity, not because of what it said in the beginning, but because of what was reflected by the drafters and what wound up in the document. You know who the people were who drafted the Constitution. They were the landed aristocracy. It was a small group of white male landowners who drafted the Constitution. They all owned property. The Constitution came out protecting property. Keep in mind that there was no specific mention of individual rights in the Constitution as an original document. It was only after a hard-fought battle that you even got the first 10 amendments, which enumerated certain rights in the Constitution. So when we go back and we look at it, we have to say, well, the Constitution is supposed to be a document that embraced the rights of all. But was it really an inclusive document, or was it an exclusive document? And I say to you, it was a document that excluded more than it included. I've already told you that African Americans were left out. Women were left out. It was more than 100 years after the adoption of the Constitution that women even got the right to vote, and only then through an amendment. Native Americans left out. Children left out. The elderly left out. Minorities of every kind were left out of the Constitution at the time of its inception. So when we talk about the document that is now in the National Archive somewhere with its yellowed pages, we are not talking about a document that was a beacon of freedom for the newly formed United States of America. Indeed, the Constitution reflected what had taken place 10 years earlier, a decade earlier, in the Declaration of Independence. Some of you, I'm sure, know that the opening words of the Declaration of Independence are as lofty a declaration as one could ever ask for. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. That's what the Declaration said in 1776. But the Declaration of Independence, like the Constitution of the United States, said nothing in condemnation of the Atlantic slave trade that was flourishing at the time. And it's not just that it didn't say anything about it, it was deliberately omitted. In the first draft of the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson had included a clause that condemned the Atlantic slave trade. But as a result of objection and then compromise, that phrase was left out of the document that we now view as the Proclamation of Freedom for all people in the United States. So then we see that there was a conscious decision made to leave out the controversial subject of slavery in the Declaration of Independence. And that was picked up a decade later in the Constitution. And what tells you even more that it was not an inadvertent omission is that 70 years later, in 1857, we find the United States Supreme Court making a very important declaration regarding the status of African Americans, and more specifically the status of slavery in the United States. In the Dred Scott decision issued by the Supreme Court in 1857, the court had an opportunity to declare that slavery was outlawed in the United States, and that once one left a slaveholding state and went into a free state, that that person was free forever. But what the court said was just the opposite. It's somewhat appalling in light of the country as we know it today. The real question presented was whether slaves were part of the sovereignty, members of the sovereignty of the country, and whether they were included in the phrase, "we the people," that introduced the Constitution. And let me just tell you what the court said in the Dred Scott decision in 1857. We think they are not referring to slaves, and that they are not included, and were not intended to be included. They had, for more than a century before, been regarded as beings of an inferior order and altogether unfit to associate with the white race, and so far inferior that they had no rights which the white man was bound to respect, and that the Negro might justly and lawfully be reduced to slavery for his benefit. Accordingly, a Negro of the African race was regarded as an article of property, and held and bought and sold as such. No one seems to have doubted the correctness of the prevailing opinion of the time. So that's the Supreme Court of the United States speaking about the status of African Americans in 1857. The same Supreme Court that a century later outlawed racial desegregation in the schools in the 1954 Brown decision, and we'll come to that. But I say that to say to you that although this is Constitution Day and we acknowledge the Constitution for being a document that has been highly instrumental in the struggle for civil rights and in the struggle for the rights of all Americans, it is not the document itself that led to the progress that has been made over the years. It has been the result of struggle, sacrifice, strife, war, turbulence, and human determination that over time has made the difference in the protection of rights under the Constitution of the United States. Soon after the Dred Scott decision was decided in 1857, the Emancipation Proclamation followed in 1863. The proclamation by Abraham Lincoln that is popularly known as the document that emancipated the slaves. I won't get into the particulars of that. And then that followed, that happened, of course, during the war. So it took a war to bring this country to the realization that the rights of African Americans were to be protected under a Constitution. But you didn't have a Constitution that protected those rights, even though you had 10 amendments that were adopted within a relatively short period of time after the Constitution itself was adopted. So the Constitution then had to be changed in order to protect the rights of the newly emancipated freed men. And it was in that context that we had the three great Civil War amendments, as we call them. The 13th, which outlawed slavery. The 14th, which guaranteed equal protection of the laws. And the 15th Amendment, which guaranteed the right to vote. One would have thought then that at this juncture, it was all done. The rights have been declared, the Constitution has been amended, the war has been won, slaves have been freed, and now we are to enter upon this great new era of equality in the land. But what happened? No sooner than the Emancipation Proclamation had been declared, no sooner than the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments had been adopted, and no sooner than the civil rights laws spanning from 1866 to 1875 had taken place, the newly emancipated, freed men and women were resubjugated by those who refused to acknowledge their equality. A public accommodations law was passed in the 1870s, which said that African Americans had the right to use public facilities the same as white Americans. But it wasn't very long before that law was gutted of any meaning that it had. And even the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment that you hear so much about was largely meaningless for black folks. The group that benefited most from the 14th Amendment for the first 50 plus years that amendment was adopted was not African Americans. It was the group of corporations that were recognized as persons who benefited mostly from the 14th Amendment. For 5 or 6 or 7 decades after it was passed. And that was because of a refusal of the majority, of the white majority in this country, to recognize the humanity of African Americans. So I won't talk about the violence, I won't talk about the repression, the suppression, the resistance, the lives that were lost, the limbs that were lost during this period of Reconstruction, as we call it, the Jim Crow era that took place. But there was an effort even then to use the Constitution of the United States to protect the rights of those who needed its protection most. And that effort resulted in a declaration by the United States Supreme Court in 1898. It's a case whose name you've heard before. It even bears my name. I had nothing to do with it. It's called Plessy versus Ferguson. And it was in Plessy versus Ferguson in 1898 that the Supreme Court declared that separate but equal was the law of the land. It was not necessary, the court said, to have blacks and whites sharing the same railroad car. As long as you provided a railroad car for blacks that was equal to the railroad car for whites, then it was okay to keep them separate. So separate but equal was the law of the land, but the reality of the land was separate but unequal. And that was true in schools, it was true on railroad cars, it was true in public accommodations of every sort and character. And it was that rule of the Supreme Court that governed the country from 1898 for a period of more than 50 years until 1954. And I won't go through the tremendous struggle that led ultimately to the 1954 decision in Brown versus Education. It wasn't an even path or even course, a steady beat to equality. And that's why I call this talk The Quest for Civil Rights uneven, uncertain, and unending. But it was through the tremendous effort of those who were committed to equality, black and white, working together to hold this country to its promise of racial equality that led ultimately to the decision in Brown versus Board of Education in 1954, when the court reversed itself from the 1898 Plessy versus Ferguson decision and said separate but equal is no longer the law of the land. And Brown emerged from school litigation, so it was in the public school context that the court said separate but equal is now outlawed. The same court that had a century earlier said that blacks had no rights, which whites were bound to respect, had now said that it's a new day. It's a new law. It's a new doctrine. No more separate but equal. I remember that day because I was a junior high school student over at Hill Street School. And the Supreme Court declared that no longer would the school that I went to be an unequal facility. And I thought within a week or two, it'd be all over. And I waited a week and nothing happened. And I waited a month and nothing happened. And I waited and waited and waited and nothing happened. And throughout my high school days, nothing happened. A little bit happened and I helped make it happen. I might tell you about that in the question and answer. But generally speaking, separate but equal was declared unlawful, but separate but equal remained the law of the land for years after the Brown decision in 1954. This was the Supreme Court interpreting the Constitution that we celebrate today as the document that gives us the freedoms that we cherish and honor and praise. But it was only after sit-in movements, bus boycotts, hoses and dogs in Alabamas, murders, savagery, brutality of every kind you can think of, that the country emerged to a point where the outlawing of the separate but equal doctrine had any real meaning. And in 1963, I may be getting a little closer to your era, and I know you wondered when I'd get there. But in 1963, you had the Great March on Washington led by Dr. Martin Luther King, and that precipitated legislation. The 1964 Civil Rights Act, which again outlawed desegregation in public accommodations, outlawed discrimination on the basis of race and other things in employment, followed by the Voting Rights Act in 1965, which was to open up political opportunities for African Americans who had not had it before, and finally the Fair Housing Act of 1968. And it was this evolution of the civil rights movement that got us to the point where we began to take seriously the rights that had been declared and promised under the Constitution. But even then, struggle was required, sacrifice was required. It was the result of the efforts of determined groups of people that held this country to its promise of racial equality, that ultimately got us to the Constitution as we know it today. But even today, even with a court over time that has declared that racial discrimination is outlawed in every facet of public life in America, we can never be sure that rights are guaranteed and assured. Once the push for school desegregation took place, and once Lyndon Johnson issued his executive order calling for affirmative action to eliminate vestiges of racism and discrimination, there was retrenchment, there was resistance on the part of those whites who felt that their position of superiority was being threatened. And so there was resistance to the whole desegregation process. There was resistance to affirmative action. And eventually that resistance has been reflected in the courts. Affirmative action is no longer favored by the courts, no longer favored by the U.S. Supreme Court. School desegregation under school desegregation orders is no longer favored by the court. Even the ability to take race into account in trying to achieve full desegregation of schools has now been cut back on by the court. In recent decisions just this last term, the court questioned seriously and limited seriously the ability of local school boards to take race into account in the desegregation process of their schools. And in decision after decision, the court has retreated on its historic position of affirmative action. And that takes place even as we know that we have not yet achieved a society where there is full equality among all of its people. Look at any index of the quality of life in America, and what you will find is that African Americans and other minorities lag behind. Infant mortality, health care, sickness, disease, AIDS, income, wealth, rates of incarceration in prison, school suspensions. You run the whole gamut. And what you find is that we have a society that still declares as its law equality. But when we look at the reality of how we live, and we look at what's happening on the ground, then we see that the true equality among racial and ethnic groups is yet to be achieved. And although as we laud and praise our Constitution today and celebrate its anniversary, we can never be sure that rights, whether they be civil rights or civil liberties, protected under the Constitution are secure. Every day, the rights that we hold dear are threatened in one way or another. And what is the most threatening thing to rights that we know? War. It is in times of war that rights are always most threatened. If you go back to World War I, you had the Alien and Sedition Acts, where the government wanted to suppress dissent and did suppress dissent. World War II, the same thing. So anytime there is war, the government says, give us emergency powers and we will keep you safe. Give us some of your rights and we'll take care of you. And what do we hear happening today? The language of war. We hear about the war on terrorism, the war in Iraq. You hear about the war on drugs. And in all of those wars, what does the government say? Just turn over some of your rights and we'll keep you safe. Let us spy on you in ways we never did before and we'll keep you safe. And what do the citizens in their fear say? Of course. Keep us safe. Who needs rights when there's a war? Who needs rights when the government's going to take care of us? So we as citizens give up our rights out of fear, out of a desire for security, out of deception, out of a belief that the way to protect rights is to surrender them to the government. And so the Patriot Act passes with almost no dissent. And a government spying program goes into effect with citizens wondering, well, why would anyone object? If you're not doing anything wrong, why not let the government look at what you're doing? And we see roundups of citizens of a particular ethnic group. Soon after the war in Iraq, it was Muslims being rounded up all over. And we say, well, what the heck? They're the people that need to be rounded up. But I can never forget, one time it was my people being rounded up. And you should always remember that at any given time, it could be you or your people. So when we talk about giving up rights, you may be thinking that you're agreeing to the giving up of the rights of someone other than yourself. But ultimately, when you give up rights, you're giving up your own right. What is the saying? If they come for you at night, in the morning, they may come for me. So as we celebrate Constitution Day, as we celebrate the progress that we have made as a nation, and we have made great progress as a nation. We now have protection for women. We now have protection for children. We now have protection for lots of groups in society for which there was no protection before. So I don't mean to stand here and say we've not made progress. We have. I simply mean to say that when we celebrate the Constitution, we're not celebrating a perfect document. We're celebrating a document that has been made meaningful through the efforts of citizens, sometimes small groups of citizens who have been committed to making the Constitution hold true on its own promise. And as the sociologist Margaret Mead once said, never doubt that a small group of dedicated people can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that changes. So as you think about your Constitution, think about your duty as a citizen and as members of small groups, whatever they are, to make sure that we are secure in the rights that were promised in the document we celebrate today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ferguson. I'd like to open it up to question and answer for a few minutes. And as I said before, in a group this size, we need to use this microphone. So I'll just open it up right now. And if you'd like to ask a question, please raise your hand and I will hand you the mic. Would somebody have me pass this microphone?
Thank you for your comments. I'd like to know how you would respond to this. I am one of those nameless people who worked in Martin Luther King's movement. Was it all in vain?
Was it all in vain? Let me dissect the question a little bit and then talk about it. First of all, was it all? When we say all, we're talking about everything that was done. And I think the answer to that is no. That had not it been for the mass movement that characterizes Dr. King's work, we would not be sitting here in this hall today with you being able to answer that question and with folks listening to me talk. The great work that you and others dedicated yourselves to bring about a different America made a difference. Did it make all the difference? The answer is no. Are we there? No. I think Dr. King would be very concerned today if he was sitting among us about where are we in terms of civil rights, where are we in terms of human rights, where are we in terms of a peaceful world, where are we in terms of eradicating poverty. Because we have to remember that Dr. King was about a lot more than just desegregating America. He was about eradicating poverty. He was on his mission to eradicate poverty at the time he was killed by an assassin. He was about bringing about peace in the world. And he was a leader in the peace movement at his time. He was criticized deeply for getting involved in resistance to the Vietnam War. Here we are today. Poverty is not only still among us, but growing. The gap between the have and the have-nots is growing every day. Dr. King would be very disturbed by that. We look at the world, and we live in a world at war. All over the globe, the world is at war, not just in Iraq, although Iraq, to me, is one of the most blatant examples of how war is pointless and how war saps our resources. Dr. King would be astounded by that. He would be leading a movement right now to move us away from war, to move us away from poverty. And Dr. King would also be very concerned about what's happening to us in our race relations today. We still live in a world which is divided by race, and it plays itself out every day. I talked to you about the differences, the disparities in race. So we have racial disparities now everywhere among us. But not just that, but also in how we relate. Schools are resegregating in America. I see it in Charlotte every day. Communities are becoming more and more segregated in America. Our organizations are becoming more and more segregated in America. The truth is, no victory stays won. So we have to continue to push for those things we fight for, understanding that it is an unending fight. So you haven't fought in vain, you haven't struggled in vain, but you can't stop fighting and you can't stop struggling. There's a question right here.
These are really big issues, and I know as college students we talk about these a lot on our campus, poverty and peace and racism, but we always seem to struggle for the next step beyond talking about what's wrong. How do we fix it? In your personal and professional opinion, what do we do? How do we put these things into action? How do we fight these fights against the injustice and inequality?
Okay. That's a great question. That's an absolutely great question, to which there's no great answer. But but I think that there are some directions that we can follow. And if you'll pardon me, I'll just take a personal reference and talk about it. I told you when I was speaking to you that I'd talk to you a little bit about my own experience here. Back when I was a high school student, the sit-in movement started in Greensboro. And it was the big news of the day, and it was happening, and it was spreading like wildfire all over the campuses. And we were here in Asheville, and we wanted to be a part of that. We didn't know what to do. We didn't have a black college here in Asheville at the time. I don't think he even had a full four-year college at the time. I think that would have been right around the time you were starting here. But in any event, we wanted to get involved. So a group of my friends and I, high school students, joined together and said we're going to get involved. And we took it upon ourselves to learn all we could about the sit-in movement, about the whole nonviolent movement. And that is when we formed a group called the Asheville Student Committee on Racial Equality, so that we could find a way to get involved. And we just talked to everybody we could. We'd stop adults and we'd talk to ministers, we'd talk to people in the community, we'd talk to leaders. And eventually we learned enough to get comfortable enough that we engaged in protest as a high school group. And I think, with what little research I've done, I think we were the only high school group in the country to do that. It was an unlikely thing for us to do. We didn't know what we were doing. We knew we had to do something. And I think the answer is, if you feel the need to do something, then do what you feel the need to do. Don't just talk about it, but form a group of others who are doing the same thing. And it may be a small step, but small steps become big steps. Martin Luther King took a small step when he took over the Montgomery movement. The last thing he wanted to do was to lead that movement. They asked him, and he said, no. I came here to build my church. They asked him again. He said, no. I came here to build my church. They asked him again, and finally he began to feel, I can't keep saying no. So he wound up the reluctant leader of the Montgomery movement. And the next thing you know, he becomes the greatest civil rights leader of our time. So none of this stuff starts as a huge movement. It all starts small. And I urge you, as difficult as it is, don't despair. Get with others, do something.
Were you at all conflicted about speaking here today?
I'm sorry?
Were you at all conflicted about speaking here today, given the lack of racial diversity on this campus?
No more conflicted than I am about living. And I don't mean to be flippant about that. I don't mean to be flippant about that, but it's everywhere. It's not just this campus. It's almost everywhere you go. And that's part of what I'm talking about. We still live in a society that's deeply divided by race. It has become more divided by the different groups that have come in. It used to be mainly just blacks and whites separated. Now it's blacks and whites and Latinos and Asians and everybody comes in, and it gets more and more separated. And I think one of the problems is that we get complacent about it, and we decide, well, the struggle is over. There's no law that says African Americans can't come to UNC Asheville. There's no law that says you can't do this. No law that says you can't do that, and therefore there's no struggle. But the law simply dismantles the legal structure for that, and it's individual action that brings about the difference. So if the law says one thing, and we talked about it in the talk, where you have the law saying one thing, but the reality is very different. And that's the reality you have today. So I was reluctant only in the sense that I want to see more diversity here. I want to see more diversity everywhere. But I don't think we get to that point unless we talk about it. And if I don't come and talk a little bit about what some of that struggle has been, then I think I'm holding us back a little bit and not moving us forward. So that's what I mean.
You started to touch on this before, but do you feel like issues of race are being superseded by issues of class in this country?
I don't think they're being superseded by it. I think it's more popular today to talk about class issues. But there has always been a close connection between race and class, and there is today. So when we talk about class, I see it as simply talking about another aspect of the civil rights movement. I did touch on it when I talked about Dr. King's crusade against poverty. And that's what he saw at the time. What he saw was not just lack of opportunity for African Americans, but what he saw was that lack of opportunity led to poverty in and of itself, where you didn't have the opportunity to work your way out of poverty because you couldn't get a job, you couldn't do this, you couldn't do that. But what he also saw was that poverty was bigger than race, that class was bigger than race in many ways, because there were whites, many whites, who also were not able to participate in the fruits of this country through lack of education, through lack of opportunity, through lack of health care, through lack of lots of things. And there were common issues among those who were racially deprived and those who were economically deprived. And part of his dream was to build a movement where people would begin to look beyond just their own race and look beyond just their own class situation and begin to see the connection between racism and ignorance and poverty, and try to bring people together to work on all of those issues. Today, people don't like to talk about race, so they talk about class. And people say it's not a problem with race anymore, it's just class. So that gets them beyond talking about a subject that's uncomfortable to talking about one they're more comfortable talking about. But the issue of race is still there. It's going to be there for some time to come. When W. Du Bois said for the 20th century that the driving issue in this country would be the issue of the color line, he could have just as easily said that's going to be the issue in the 21st century as well, because it's still with us. And discussion and talk about class does not take away from race. To me, it expands the discussion about race, and we've got to deal with both.
Okay, I have a question about the extension of voting rights for African Americans as opposed to having the full right, if that makes sense.
I'm sorry, let me hear the question again.
On the extension of voting rights for African Americans as opposed to just being flat out able to vote as it was intended. That makes sense?
Let me see if I understand your question and tell me whether I'm answering it or not. In this day and time, with all of the rights that have been declared under the Constitution and the Voting Rights Act having been passed, and the increase in numbers of African Americans voting, the increase in the number of elected officials we see. I think you have an African American mayor here now, and there are others around. Some folks tend to think, well, the issue at the ballot box is over. There's no further need to protect rights. But if we look at it, we begin to see that issue is still very much alive, and that there's still a need for a Voting Rights Act to protect rights at the ballot box. One of the most recent big examples of that was what happened in Florida during the presidential election, where large numbers of African American votes were cast out, and people were not allowed to give the opportunity to have their votes counted. There are issues regarding felons having the right to vote. When you look at what happens in the prisons, who's in prison, the black folks are in prison for the most part. And when you take away the rights of ex-prisoners or ex-felons to vote, you're taking away a disproportionate number of votes from the African American community. And there are other examples all the time. You can go into communities throughout America, and particularly in places in the South, where schemes are still in place to try to dilute the votes of African Americans and other minorities. So there is still a need to have particular protections for the rights at the ballot box, because those rights are among the most important rights that we have, because that's where we elect our representatives, and if we don't have full voting strength to do that, then we lose our voice in deciding who represents us and who makes the laws. So that's a long way of saying I think we still have a tremendous need for continuation and extension of the Voting Rights Act, and I think that'll be with us for some time to come.
Oh, I have one more question, if I may ask,
Sure.
please, and I'll leave you alone.
Don't leave me alone. Keep asking.
Okay, the 13th Amendment. Do you think, or could you say that because of our justice system or criminal system where we put mostly African Americans in prison, that's a sort of a change from putting us in open slavery to divert to water down the voting populace or the people who are contributors, if that makes sense?
Well, the 13th Amendment was designed to do two things. To eliminate slavery and to eliminate the incidences of slavery. So it's not just the release of the chains, but the consequences of slavery. And do I think that there's still consequences of slavery that we see today? Yes. Do I think that the prisons may be a reflection of that? The answer is yes. And I say that for this reason. When we look at the prison population today, whether it's on the local level or the national level, you'll find that there is a huge disproportion of minorities, particularly African Americans and Latino Americans, who are in prison. I, for one, do not accept that that's just a coincidental thing, that African Americans just happen to commit more crime than white folks do, and therefore they're in prison in larger numbers. What has really happened is that the prison explosion has taken place since 1980. Before that, interestingly enough, the proportion of African Americans in prison compared to whites in prison was nowhere near as stark as it is today. If you go all the way back to the 1930s and 40s, the numbers of African American in prison, the percentages were about the same as the percentages in the population as a whole. Since 1980, with the declaration of the war on drugs, there has been a dramatic change in the makeup of the prison population of this country. And as a result, I argue to you, of the war on, so-called war on drugs, you've had an almost complete reversal of the numbers, so that the numbers of African Americans in prison has skyrocketed because of the enforcement of the drug laws. Now, the statistics are that drug use among African Americans and white Americans is about the same as the percentages of use in the population as a whole. So it's not that African Americans are using drugs, or purchasing drugs, or selling drugs in greater proportion than whites. It's simply the way the laws are enforced. And of course you all know about the crack cocaine, powder cocaine thing, where powder cocaine was the drug of choice for whites, crack cocaine was the drug of choice for blacks, and even though they had the same potency, crack cocaine carried 10 times the sentence of powder cocaine. So you wound up with a lot of African Americans in prison with that. But it's not just that. It's the way the laws are enforced. In a lot of poor communities, the drug dealing and drug smoking and drug using takes place outside and on the streets. It's easy for cops to enforce that. In a lot of the white communities, it takes place in the suites and in homes and not outside, where it's harder to enforce. So you wind up with tremendous disparities in who gets prosecuted, who gets arrested, who gets prosecuted, and who gets imprisoned for drugs. And that's a long way of saying that I do think what's happening in the prison population is a reflection of what's happening in racial issues in the country today. I think it's also a reflection of a continuation of an incidence and badge of slavery where the laws are not being applied equally and fairly, but are being applied in disproportionate ways against African Americans and increasingly other populations, other minority groups among us.
Folks, we have time for one more question.
There's one over here.
Thank you so much for commenting on the 2000 election. A lot of people, I think, have forgotten that. That I was greatly disturbed by that, the violations of civil rights there. I had two, but since I have time for one, I was wondering if you would educate us, if this is something on on the power of the people to impeach their president. People in my small group believe that there was a number of reasons for the impeachment that take place. Primary would be misleading a country into war under false pretenses. Reason I'm concerned about it is obviously because Congress is kind of dragging their feet, as well as I've heard that once the next election occurs, that impeachment is not a way to prosecute possible crimes around this declaration of war. So if you could educate us on the provisions of impeachment in the Constitution.
Well, I'll give you some thoughts. I don't know if I can educate you. Impeachment is an interesting issue. And, you know, I don't hesitate to tell folks where I am on certain issues of the day, but I am appalled, quite frankly, at how it is that one president can be impeached, actually. Not convicted of impeachment, but impeached on the basis of lying about some sexual personal relationship that had no particular consequences for the country as a whole. And then another president who has been revealed to have misled the country about a war. We hear talk of impeachment and people say it's crazy, it's outrageous. But the process itself is a difficult one. And that's why you've had so few impeachments. And I think there's only one, I think. Who was it, Hayes or somebody, way back, I can't remember exactly. So in terms of the practicalities of where impeachment leads you, I think it's difficult to argue that you're likely to have a successful impeachment of the president. The question then becomes, well, where do you put your energies? And not only is it difficult to get impeachment, it's difficult to get a resolution passed defunding the war. So, you know, it's hard to think that impeachment, even if the basis for it is present, is a practical and likely way to address the issues that took place. Nonetheless, I do think that it's incumbent upon us as citizens to hold our leaders accountable for leadership, for telling the truth, for acknowledging error when there is error, and not for allowing them a free pass for misleading the country. We have an impeachment every 4 years, and sometimes that can be the most effective impeachment we have when we vote as to who will continue to lead the country. And it's in that process where I think the citizens have the greatest hand and where we have to exercise that to reflect our beliefs in our leadership and in our process. Okay.
Well, folks, we have come to the end of our hour, and I would just encourage humanities students to please carry on this discourse in your sessions. You will be reading a number of works about the civil rights movement coming into next week. And on behalf of UNCA and the Humanities Program, Dr. Ferguson, we thank you so much for your enthusiasm.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm going to run out quickly to the bench, and I'll come back and talk to students. Thank you.